All right, hello everyone. I'm Teresa, and we're not going to watch a video, but I bet you can imagine how amazing it would have been. So what the video was going to show you was a culture of belonging, and that is what we're here to talk about today. We're here to talk about connection and belonging and how to create an environment where your employees can feel like they belong. So I'm going to see what happens.
Imagine walking into a space with the confidence that you are understood, even if it's uncomfortable or challenging. A space to be and feel open and achieve your goals, where every individual is more than a set of labels. Imagine being in a place where you are guided to understand yourself more and more, where you unlock your limitations to grow. Imagine a business that celebrates its own individuality as well as yours, where there is an openness, a willingness to ignite growth, development, and change, reaching every corner, every department, and every team. Imagine this business is where you work, where you are surrounded by people who know how to navigate the hurdles and sensitivities that make being human so deeply complex, where you are guided to transform and thrive individually and as a collective, where all perspectives are voiced and heard. Imagine feeling connected and limitless, being in a place where your story can unfold. Imagine belonging.
If we can get the slides back up, we'll move beyond that into our content. So what we are going to be talking about today is how to create the culture that you saw a little snippet of there. But what we want to talk about first is what are some of the barriers that get in the way of creating cultures of belonging? Because while that is the environment that we want to create, oftentimes there's a disconnect between what we're actually experiencing and what our employees are experiencing and what we're trying to work towards in terms of a culture of belonging. And part of the reason is because we're living in a time where modern advances have created a lot of really great change, globalization, digitalization, hybrid work. All of these things have been great, but sometimes the modern world is actually working against us. Sometimes it's creating more disconnect and cognitive overload than the good that it's doing. We live in a paradoxical age where we're not only digitally connected, but we're also feeling lonely, isolated, sometimes depressed, even though we're more digitally connected. We're more flexible with our hybrid work, and yet we're more overextended, stressed out, overcapacity. Our basic needs are met, and yet we're feeling like we're not connected, and our basic need for connection is unmet. So there's this disconnect that we have where these new worlds of not being in person and not being connected in the traditional ways is creating a gap. And as organizations, we have taken the efforts of DE&I and we have tried to create some of those connections, but we haven't always done it right. In fact, we've gotten it wrong sometimes. We've put people in categories. We've given people labels. We've actually made some people feel shamed based on some of the work and the efforts that we've done to try to bring people together. And sometimes when we're doing that work around DE&I, we're forgetting about what it's all really about, which is connection. At the core of what we're trying to do with DE&I is we're trying to connect people and create equity and inclusion and belonging. And nobody can argue with that. Like, that's a really great thing. And yet we're met with resistance because of the way we've set it up sometimes. I'm sure you've seen some of these very headlines that I'm showing you here It's been a hard couple of years. And for somebody who's really passionate about this, and this is my life's work, I don't like waking up and seeing these headlines because of the good intentions we have around creating inclusive cultures. These are not where we want to be in terms of the impact we're trying to make around inclusion and belonging. So if we're going to change this, we have to admit to ourselves that we need to take a different path forward. We have to admit that we may have gotten this a little bit wrong and that there's maybe a new and different way of moving forward. So at Talking Talent, we think that it's time to reset DE&I. And we think that the way to do that is by focusing on what unites us rather than what divides us, what connects us rather than looking at our differences. So if we can flip the script on this, and if we can focus on that need around connection, we will be able to advance our DE&I efforts in a different way. And the reason that connection is important is because it's a fundamental, innate need that we have as human beings. So we are hardwired biologically to need connection. Dr. Matthew Lieberman has actually done some research on this and shows that our need for connection surpasses our need for health and safety. So our basic needs of health and safety, connection surpasses that. So think about that. In this world that I described to you, where we have these barriers that are causing us to not connect right now, we're not meeting our fundamental need for connection. And so if we can bring that into our organizations and figure out, well, how do we connect people? What does it look like to connect people, to meet those basic needs? Then DE&I can become an outcome of that human connection. It doesn't have to be the initial goal. It can be the outcome that we get to organizations that are more diverse, more equitable, more inclusive, and have cultures of belonging because we've fostered the one thing that is our innate human need, which is connection. So I want to have you do a little exercise around connection right now. I am going to demonstrate. These are my 4 children, Kyan, Brexton, Taya, and Vivia, and they are important to me because they are my children and I want to have a good relationship with them and be a good role model for them. So one of the ways that I foster my relationship with them is that Steve mentioned we ski, they're ski racers. And so I drive across the country, oftentimes 15-hour car trips from Minnesota to Denver or other places in Colorado, and we talk about everything on those car trips. And that is one of the ways I foster my relationship with them. Now, what I want you to do, and I don't want to regret doing this, so please play along with me nicely. I am going to ask you to take your phones out, something that every speaker should not do, right? So if you could take your phones out, and I'm going to give you 20 seconds to find a picture of a relationship that is meaningful to you. All right? Find a picture of a relationship that is meaningful to you. Don't overthink it. Just find a picture of a relationship that's meaningful to you. Hopefully we're in a judgment-free zone, so you can show any picture. It doesn't have to be the best picture you can find of the person. Okay, now what I'm going to ask you to do, and I'm going to give you a short amount of time for this, so when you see me up here like trying to get your attention, I'm going to need you back. I'm going to need your attention back. But I'm going to ask you to turn to somebody next to you and tell the person, first introduce yourself, but then tell the person who this relationship is, why it's meaningful to you, and what you do to nurture it. Okay, I'm going to give you about 30 seconds each. So do the introduction, give your little spiel, then have the other person do it. And then watch for my sign to come back, okay? All right, that was pretty good. I only had to ask you twice. I usually have to ask my kids like 4 or 5 times. You are all doing very well. So how do you feel after connecting with that person? You may have sat down next to them. Well, chances are you probably sat by somebody you know because that's our general tendency, right? But you may not have known something about that person that you know now based on sharing that. You found an interest and a commonality in human connection. We may not have commonality with other people. We may have a lot of difference with the people that we work with, but if we can find ways to have those moments of commonality. Steve mentioned about the skiing. Steve and I connected over skiing at one of the From Day One events a couple of years ago. It's been our point of connection since. We talk about that when we see each other. Finding ways to connect and find common interests rather than division and differences is an important part of our human connection. On Monday, I had to speak at another event. I actually thought I was doing a workshop, a breakout workshop for a small group of people. I was filling in for a colleague who has pneumonia. So I hopped on a flight, went to Orlando, showed up, and they said, let's get you mic'd up to be on stage. And I said, wait a minute, what are you talking about? And they said, well, you have to go meet with the production team. And so I said, well, how many people are going to be looking at this stage? And they said, oh, about 250. I said, oh, okay, that's different than I thought. So I was backstage, and I think the MC, who happened to be a TV producer, noticed that I may have been a little caught off guard, and I'll be vulnerable and tell you, a little nervous actually, only because it was different than my expectation. And so his name was Rodney, and Rodney started a conversation with me. And Rodney did exactly what I'm talking to you about here today. He found a point of commonality. His oldest had just gone off to college. My oldest just went off to college. And Rodney and I started bonding over the fact that it's really hard to say goodbye to your kid when they go to college. Through that experience, I became more effective, more confident, more productive and ready to go out on stage and do what I was there to do. So that connection has business impact as well. It makes us more effective when we feel like we belong and we connect, and there are people around us that support who we are and the way that we are. That connection is something that we need to deliberately build into our workforce. So how can you take connection and make sure that it is the thread in all of the efforts that you have around building a culture of inclusion? All of your people efforts that are looking at how can you engage people? How can you get the best out of people? Making sure that connection is a common thread and that you're taking leaders along on the journey with you as well. So representation is something that we've focused on a lot when it comes to DE&I, and representation is important, so I do not want you to leave here getting the message that it's not. But when we look at DE&I as only about representation, and when we look at it as something that we have to do, that we have to get this representation, we are not focusing on what truly brings us to an inclusive culture of belonging and the outcomes of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is helping people belong, helping people feel like they connect so that then people who are diverse in our organization, which, by the way, there are many of us who are diverse when we look at intersectionality, but people want to stay because we've created that connection and that belonging for them. Inclusion also means that we don't exclude anyone. And I think this is one of the major areas that where we've gone wrong. This means that everyone's voice matters. If you stop by our booth, you can have a little sticker that says DE&I is for everyone. Because we truly believe that if we're going to solve the belonging equation, that we need everyone's voice at the table. And this means the majority has to be at the table as well. But what do we even mean by the majority? Like, how do we know what the majority looks like? We use that term, but if we think about the majority, let's say we assume white men are the majority. Well, what about the white man who didn't go to an Ivy League institution, but at his organization, everyone else did, and they talk about it all the time, and it's a sign of status and a symbol that he doesn't belong. He's being excluded. He's part of the out group, right? What about the white man who's neurodivergent, or who identifies as gay, or who has a disability that we can't see? There are a lot of different intersectionalities that we all bring that we can't assume we know what the majority group looks like, because we don't know. We don't know until we connect with people, we don't know what their story is and how to bring them in. And so we have to make this about everyone, and we can't use shame, and we can't use labels, and we can't put people into categories. We need to create cultures where everyone uses empathy, everyone uses understanding, curiosity to connect with each other so that we all feel like we're aligned toward this goal of creating a culture where everybody belongs. Cross-cultural dialogue is another important area of focus as we think about what we're doing. So when we look at how can we bring cultures together to create cultural intelligence, cultural intelligence means that I have an understanding of your culture because I've taken the time to learn and understand through you or other people what it is like to be different from my culture and where I come from. There's actually a cool TikTok trend right now where white women are commenting on black women hairstyles and black women are commenting on white women. And so this cross-cultural exchange around hair is a great example of cultural intelligence and getting to know each other better through conversation. So can we create spaces within our organizations where that is happening? We have a leader that we coached along the way, and because they were looking at how can we create this connection from the top down, which is what we recommend. Like, how can you create the connection from the top down? So this leader here in New York, every time he got in the elevator, he would try to turn to the side and not make eye contact with anyone. He didn't want anyone to ask him hard questions, all right? So he tried to avoid people, which we identified as a problem. And so we worked with him to get comfortable in making eye contact with people. We did coaching with him, helped create awareness with him, helped give him skills. How do you get curious? How do you have a conversation? Because even though our leaders are at the top of our organization, they don't always have those skills. We didn't teach them along the way. So then we were back to do some work over at the Flatiron building, and the leader was in the back of this crowded elevator, and there were a whole bunch of people in there and didn't really see us sneak in the front, and rode the whole way up. And he was talking to everyone. He was making eye contact with people. He was asking questions, curious. It worked. The coaching worked, and it created an environment where people felt safe talking to this leader, which is an important part of inclusion and belonging. When you think about the surveys that you do and the scores that you give, do you think people are feeling connected and feel like they belong in your organization because you held a training on unconscious bias? That might help, but really, having the president talk to you in an elevator and having him want to know more about you, that's going to create belonging in a way that's different than sending people to a training. So as we think about how we can build this into our organizations, there are a lot of different things you can do. We can build connection circles, so bringing people together from across different levels, different divisions of the business, different ethnicities, different whatever difference you want to have, bringing people together to talk about lived experiences, to be able to share with one another and learn, creating community, creating connection. The human library concept, where you actually have people volunteer to be checked out, so that I can check out an employee to learn more about something that I'm not familiar with, to learn more about what it's like to have a disability or to be a veteran or whatever it might be, like to be able to check you out and learn. And you volunteer to be part of the library, but it creates that cultural awareness that I was talking about. Reverse leadership programs, reverse mentoring for leaders. So the leader that I told you about in the elevator, having a leader like that be able to learn from other generations within the workforce about what it's like to be at the organization, what it's like to be them, what it's like to be part of an out group. We talk a lot in my house right now, as 2 7th grade girls are living with me, about out groups and in groups. But as a leader, sometimes we forget what it's like to be part of an out group, and how that basic need for connection isn't met when we're part of an outgroup. And there are lots of ways to be part of an outgroup. I remember early in my career when I didn't have any kids, and people would go out to the bar with some of the leaders, and my colleagues who had children felt really torn because they didn't want to be left out, but they had to get home to their families. And then as my career progressed, I became part of that out group. I was the in group, and then I became part of the out group. Neither one feels good. I didn't feel good excluding people, but I also didn't feel good at being excluded. So being aware of just those little things, and if we have that knowledge being shared with leaders, we're more likely to pay attention to it. We also have to make sure that we're not using connection and thinking of it as a fluffy term. Like, it actually can create change in your organization. And I know that might sound simple, like connection. Yeah, connection's not that big of a deal. It is a big deal, and it can create change. So if we create the connection first, diversity, equity, and inclusion will follow. If we get it right, and we truly lean into this idea of human connection, we then will create cultures where diversity, equity, and inclusion flourish. And in order to do that, we have to align it with our business strategy. What are we trying to solve? I am going to guess that there isn't one business problem you have in your strategy that can't be solved with more connection. Whether it's client-facing, whether it's market-facing, whether it's internal, connection is the cure. And so how are you skilling people up to learn how to connect? Even though it's an innate basic need, because of those barriers I talked about earlier, we're not as good at connection as we used to be. Our ancestors used to be really good at it because they needed it to survive. We're not so good at it anymore. So how can we teach connection, empathy, understanding, curiosity, compassion, all of those skills that we see as fluffy things that are part of soft skills training? And making sure we're measuring the right thing. So measuring based on what are the surveys telling you about belonging, about how included people feel. And when you're looking at the data for everyone, not just the underrepresented groups, but looking at the data. We actually, at Talking Talent, don't have a lot of men in our organization because we haven't, along the way, we've had a lot of women that have applied. And so we are intentional in looking at the data to say, you know what? We might value from having some diverse perspective of men in our organization. We have some, but we could use more. So it's not just about looking at what we refer to as the underrepresented groups. It's looking at the data on the full set and saying, where as a business do we need to do better to make sure all voices are being represented at the table? And making sure that we understand that this is about individual change and systemic change within our organization. That's why we are a coaching business, not a training business. So we are coaching leaders, and we do coaching-led training and interventions that help bring people along in a bigger capacity. But it's all with the idea that we have to change our mindsets and our behaviors at an individual level. And as an organizational level, we need to culminate that into change. So if we can buy into this concept that we can change the script for DE&I by looking at connection as the starting point. It can be the cornerstone of inclusion and belonging. And we can get the business outcomes that we're looking for if we can focus on what unites us rather than what divides us. So the first step in leaving here is to know, how am I going to do one small thing? Because it can feel overwhelming to think, well, what is connection and how am I supposed to do this? But start small. Habits and change are things that start small. So start with a connection. Somebody that you are meeting with here today, connect with me. My information is up there. Call me. You can have a conversation with me. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn. But connect with other people and then start thinking about the strategies we talked about and how you can bring those back to create connection within your organization. And the challenge that I will leave you with today is to think about how you can create more inclusive environments of belonging if you are willing to change your focus from the traditional way of looking at DE&I to looking at how can I build connection? How can I get to the same result, the same outcome, the same goal, but going at it in a different way? And if we can do that, if we can really help people feel seen, heard, valued because they're connected, then we have the opportunity to create cultures of inclusion and to unleash our whole human potential. So I appreciate your time today and hope you'll connect with me.